The invisible line that stretches 5,525 miles from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, separating the United States from Canada, is not a natural feature of geography but a political artifact born from military conquest over 2.5 centuries ago. That border, the longest undefended international boundary in the world, exists in its current form because British armies and naval forces defeated France in the French and Indian War, a conflict that raged from 1754 to 1763 and fundamental. Had the outcome been different, had French forces triumphed instead, the map of North America would be unrecognizable today. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and vast territories stretching to the Rocky Mountains might well have remained under French control, eventually becoming part of an expanded Canada, or perhaps forming an entirely different nation with French as its primary language and French legal and cultural traditions as its foundation. The border we take for granted, the peaceful line that millions cross annually for trade and tourism, represents nothing less than the permanent territorial consequences of 18th century military victory, a reminder that borders are not inevitable, but contingent, determined by which armies prevailed in conflicts whose outcomes were never predetermined. To understand how completely the French and Indian War determined North American political geography, one must first understand what the continent looked like before the war and what each imperial power claimed. In 1750, France claimed an enormous crescent of territory that stretched from the mouth of the St. Peter's Olivier, Lawrence River in the northeast, through the Great Lakes, down the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans. This was New France, a vast territory that dwarfed the relatively narrow strip of British colonies clinging to the Atlantic seaboard. French claims encompassed most of what is now eastern Canada, including Quebec and the Maritime provinces, as well as the entire Great Lakes region, comprising modern Ontario, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. French traders, missionaries, and soldiers had penetrated deep into the continent, establishing forts and trading posts at strategic locations, forging alliances with Indian tribes, and claiming sovereignty over territories that contained only a handful of French settlers, but represented incalculable strategic and economic value. The architectural logic of French territorial claims was brilliant in its strategic conception. By controlling the St. Lawrence River, France controlled access to the interior of the continent from the northeast. By controlling the Great Lakes, they commanded the water routes that were the highways of the pre-industrial age. By controlling the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi River system, they dominated the central corridor of the continent and had direct access to the Gulf of Mexico. If France could maintain and consolidate these claims, they would effectively contain the British colonies east of the Appalachian Mountains, preventing westward expansion and ensuring that Britain's American possessions remained economically and strategically limited. The French understood that territorial control in North America was not primarily about settling large populations. France never sent mass migration to the Americas comparable to British colonial settlement, but about controlling key strategic points, major waterways, and alliances with Indian nations who could project French power across vast territories. British territorial claims, by contrast, were based primarily on continuous settlement along the Atlantic coast from Maine to Georgia, with increasing pressure for expansion westward across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio Valley. British colonists numbered approximately 1.5 million by 1750. Vastly outnumbering the roughly 60,000 French colonists in New France, but the British were geographically constrained, while the French ranged freely across the interior. British colonial charters often included vague claims to lands extending westward to the Pacific Ocean, theoretical claims that meant nothing without actual occupation, and that conflicted directly with French claims to the same territories. The Ohio Valley became the flashpoint, because both powers recognized its strategic importance. For the British, the Ohio Valley represented the natural direction of colonial expansion. Fertile lands, where settlers could establish farms and communities. For the French, the Ohio Valley was the crucial link between their Canadian possessions to the north and their Louisiana territory to the south. Whichever power controlled the Ohio Valley would determine the future territorial structure of eastern North America. When fighting began in 1754, with skirmishes between Virginia militia under a young George Washington and French forces in the Ohio Valley, the underlying question was simple but profound. Would North America be French or British? Would the vast interior territories remain under French control with British colonists confined to the coastal regions? Or would British power expand westward, breaking the French territorial arc and opening the continent to British settlement? For 7 years this question was contested in forests, on lakes, before fortress walls, and in battles ranging from the frontiers of Pennsylvania to the heights above Quebec City. The outcome was never certain. France had significant advantages, including better relations with most Indian tribes, superior knowledge of wilderness warfare, and a military establishment experienced in frontier combat. Britain had advantages in naval power, larger colonial populations, and eventually a willingness to commit enormous military and financial resources to the North American theater. The turning point came with the British capture of Louisbourg in 1758, Quebec in 1759, and Montreal in 1760, effectively ending French power in Canada. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, formally ending the 7 Years' War globally, France ceded to Britain all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans, which was ceded to Spain along with French territories west of the Mississippi. France retained only the tiny fishing islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon off Newfoundland. In one diplomatic stroke, validated by military conquest, France disappeared as a territorial power in North America. The entire Great Lakes region, the Ohio Valley, the Illinois country, and Canada itself became British possessions. The territorial framework established by this treaty would determine North American borders for the next 2.5 centuries. The immediate consequence was that British authority now extended from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. This created an enormous administrative challenge. How would Britain govern these vast new territories? The Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempted to address this by establishing the proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains, temporarily forbidding colonial settlement west of this line to avoid conflicts with Indian tribes and to give British authorities time to develop a coherent Western policy. This proclamation infuriated colonists who had expected to settle the western lands that Britain had just conquered, and it contributed to the growing tensions that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. But the proclamation also established a pattern. British authorities in London would determine policy for these territories, not colonial assemblies, setting up the constitutional conflicts over sovereignty and representation that would tear the empire apart. When the American Revolution began in 1775, the territorial legacy of the French and Indian War became crucial to how the conflict unfolded. The 13 colonies that rebelled were the old British coastal colonies. Canada, the former New France, remained largely loyal to Britain, partly because the Quebec Act of 1774 had guaranteed French Canadians their language, religion, and legal system, creating a degree of accommodation that made British rule acceptable to the French-speaking population. American attempts to bring Canada into the Revolution, including a military invasion in 1775 and 1776, failed completely. Canada would remain British, and this established the fundamental division that would eventually become the international border. The Treaty of Paris of 1783, which ended the American Revolution and recognized American independence, drew the boundary between the new United States and British North America, the territories that would eventually become Canada. This boundary followed the Saint de Vicaries, the State, Lawrence River, and the Great Lakes, then ran westward to the Lake of the Woods, with the boundary west of that point to be determined later. This border was not arbitrary. It recognized the military and political realities created by the French and Indian War and modified by the American Revolution. Britain had conquered French Canada and retained it. The 13 colonies had successfully rebelled and secured independence. The boundary between them followed natural features, primarily the Great Lakes, that had been important during the French period and remained strategically significant. The War of 1812 tested this border through military force, with American attempts to conquer Canada failing just as they had during the Revolution. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 essentially restored the pre-war boundary, confirming that the border would remain where it had been established after the Revolution. Subsequent agreements, including the Treaty of 1818, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, and the Oregon Treaty of 1846, extended the border westward and resolved various disputed sections, ultimately creating the modern boundary from Atlantic to Pacific. But the fundamental division, the fact that there was a British North America separate from the United States, that division was the direct consequence of British victory in the French and Indian War. Consider the alternative scenario. If France had won the French and Indian War, if British forces had been defeated in their campaigns against Louisbourg, Quebec, and Montreal, the map of North America would have evolved completely differently. French control of Canada and the Great Lakes region would have been confirmed and strengthened. French territorial claims to the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi watershed would have been validated. The British colonies would have remained confined east of the Appalachians, unable to expand westward in the face of French military power and French allied Indian tribes. The demographic and economic growth of the British colonies would have been stunted by lack of room for expansion. It is entirely plausible that frustrated British colonists, unable to expand westward and increasingly dissatisfied with imperial policies, might have rebelled even earlier than they did historically, but their rebellion would have faced a completely different strategic situation. A successful American Revolution in a scenario where France still controlled Canada and the interior would have resulted in a much smaller United States, perhaps limited to the Atlantic seaboard and unable to expand westward. Alternatively, if the revolution had failed or never occurred, British North America would have remained a collection of coastal colonies, prosperous perhaps, but limited in territory and unable to become the continental power that the United States actually became. Meanwhile, French territories in North America, if they had survived French control or passed to another power when France lost them, would likely have evolved into separate nations. Quebec might have become independent during the French Revolutionary period or the Napoleonic era. The Great Lakes region and Ohio Valley might have become French-speaking territories, eventually joining Canada or forming independent nations. New York specifically illustrates how different history could have been. In 1750, New York was a British colony, but French forces operated just to the north in the Lake Champlain Corridor, and along the Saint Champlain Corridor, Lawrence, French strategy during the French and Indian War included potential campaigns southward from Canada into New York, attempting to split the British colonies and establish French control over the Hudson River Valley. If such campaigns had succeeded, if French forces had captured Albany and pushed down the Hudson to threaten New York City itself, the entire geography of colonial North America would have been redrawn. New York might have become French territory, a northern extension of New France, with French forts controlling the Hudson River, just as they controlled the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes. The cultural, linguistic, and political development of what is now New York State would have followed French patterns. The city of New York itself might have become a French colonial port, rather than the English and Dutch-influenced city it actually became. Extending this scenario further, Pennsylvania, with its strategic Ohio Valley borderlands, might have fallen under French influence or control. The entire region that became the American Midwest, the territories of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, would certainly have remained under French control if France had won the war. These territories would likely have been settled primarily by French colonists, developed according to French legal and land tenure systems, and governed as extensions of Quebec. When these territories eventually gained autonomy or independence, they would have formed French-speaking states or provinces, fundamentally altering the linguistic and cultural map of North America. The long-term consequences extend even to the present day. The United States became a continental power, stretching from Atlantic to Pacific, because it inherited the territorial framework established by British victory in the French and Indian War. American settlers pushed westward into the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and beyond, because these territories became British in 1763 and then American in 1783. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, where the United States acquired from France the vast territory west of the Mississippi, was only possible because France no longer had its North American empire, and Napoleon needed money for European wars more than he valued distant American territories that he could not effectively control or defend. If France had maintained a strong position in North America after winning the French and Indian War, there would have been no Louisiana Purchase, because France would not have been willing to sell and might have been powerful enough to defend its claims. Canada itself exists as a separate nation because it remained British when the 13 colonies became independent. Canadian national identity developed in significant part through defining itself as not American, as a British North American society that valued parliamentary governance, gradual reform, and loyalty to the Crown over American-style republicanism and revolution. But this Canadian identity was only possible because Canada was British rather than French, or rather because Britain had conquered French Canada and then retained it after the American Revolution. French-Canadian identity, the identity of Quebec, developed within a British framework that eventually became a Canadian framework, creating the bilingual federal nation that Canada is today. Had France retained Canada, Quebec would not be a province of an English-speaking country, but likely the core of a French-speaking nation dominating northeastern North America. The cultural and linguistic geography of North America today is the direct result of French defeat in 1763. English is the dominant language of the United States and English-speaking Canada because Britain won the French and Indian War. French survives as a major language only in Quebec and scattered communities because French power was broken militarily before it could be consolidated demographically. The legal systems, the educational institutions, the religious patterns, the entire cultural framework of the United States and English-speaking Canada reflects British victory. American common law derives from English law, not the French civil law tradition. American political institutions derive from British parliamentary traditions, adapted to republican and federal forms. These patterns were established because Britain controlled the territories where the United States developed, and Britain controlled those territories because it conquered them from France. The border between the United States and Canada, that invisible line stretching across the continent, marks the limit of American territorial expansion northward and the limit of Canadian territorial extent southward. But more fundamentally, it marks the boundary between territories that were secured by Britain in the French and Indian War and then either retained after American independence or lost to the new republic. Every mile of that border has a history rooted in 18th century imperial warfare. The sections following the Great Lakes mark the former boundary between French and British territorial claims, a boundary that France maintained by force until British military superiority ended French power. The sections running along the 49th parallel west of the Lake of the Woods represent negotiated compromises between the United States and Britain in the early 19th century, but those negotiations were only necessary because Britain had first acquired these territories through conquest of France and various agreements with other European powers. When Americans and Canadians today cross this border, when trucks carry goods between Detroit and Windsor, or when families visit relatives across the Niagara River. They are crossing a boundary that exists because General Wolfe's army climbed the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham in 1759 and delivered those two perfect volleys that shattered the French army. They are crossing a boundary that exists because Admiral Boscawen's fleet captured Louisbourg in 1758, cutting Canada off from French reinforcement. They are crossing a boundary that exists because General Amherst's army accepted the surrender of Montreal in 1760, ending French military resistance. Every customs post, every border crossing, every sign marking the international boundary is a monument to British military victory in the French and Indian War. The peaceful nature of the modern border, the fact that it has been essentially undefended since the early 20th century, and that it represents cooperation rather than confrontation, obscures its origins in military conquest and imperial warfare. But that peaceful border was only possible because the fundamental territorial question, which European power would control North America, was settled decisively by force of arms between 1754 and 1763. France tried to maintain its North American empire and failed. Britain succeeded in destroying French power and claimed the territories France had held. Those territories then evolved, through further wars and negotiations, into the United States and Canada. But none of that evolution would have been possible without the British victory that eliminated France as a North American territorial power. The United States-Canada border exists because Britain beat France in the French and Indian War. This is not speculation or alternative history but historical fact. The territorial transfers formalized in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 directly created the political geography from which modern North America emerged. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and all the territories of the Great Lakes and the interior are part of the United States rather than Canada, or rather than some French-speaking nation that might have evolved from New France, specifically because British armies conquered those territories from France, and then, after the American Revolution, those territories became American rather than remaining British. The border that separates these American territories from Canada reflects where British power extended after the French and Indian War, and which of those British territories successfully achieved independence in the Revolution. Every aspect of this geography, from the location of the border to the national identities on either side of it, traces back to military outcomes in the 1750s and 1760s. Borders are not accidents of geography, but products of history. And the U.S. Canada border is a product of the French and Indian War as surely as if that war's battles were still being fought along its length. The map of North America is written in the outcome of 18th century imperial warfare, and no line on that map illustrates this truth more clearly than the border that exists because Britain triumphed and France fell.